God King, chapter 25. We're getting to the end. Let's see what happens. The confrontation. The black tents circled the many-colored tabernacle. After the great swarm of Sennacherib's camp, after the endless lines of horses, the rows of terrible rammed towers, they seemed few and paltry. Only the tabernacle itself rivaling the proud tent of the Assyrian king. And there was another difference. This was a defeated army. The soldiers sat by their cookpots, heads hanging down, little heart left in them for talk and games. Even the rumor of news had awakened little interest. Would the king of Judah offer tribute to the pharaoh? What would they get out of it? The ostrich plumes drooped. The standards of the tribes, with their beasts' heads, hung limp. Beyond them lay the tents for the wounded, and Taharka remembered the school for the children of the god and the lessons in anatomy. How many of them had died? His eyes were drawn again to the tabernacle. He was in there. He was very angry, Taharka knew. Shabbataka didn't like to lose, but he had been given a second chance. He would go back to Thebes, to Napata, with a victory after all. Like Ramesses the Great, he too would have tribute from the land of Canaan. And Taharka knew he would make them pay dearly for the humiliation he had suffered. A line of the tall Somali soldiers barred the approach to the tabernacle. Amos's voice was in his ear. "Say nothing. You are the king. I will speak for you." The voice of the Judahite herald, the voice like the bullhorn, shivered the air. "A message from my king, for him who calls himself king of Cush and Pharaoh in Egypt." For the first time there was a stir among the soldiers. Who calls himself? What was this? A man came from the tabernacle. Another spokesman, another Rab Shakah. Taharka didn't recognize him. He too was a Somali. "Let them pass. Let the messengers of Judah approach the chair of Pharaoh." The herald looked at Taharka and Amos. Amos shook his head. "Let him who calls himself Pharaoh come out." The Somali spokesman returned to the tent. For just a moment he had looked hard at Taharka, surprised and curious. "Let him be curious too," Taharka prayed in silence. To Horus the hawk or Yahweh of the mountain, he didn't know which. "Let him be curious enough to come out. Let him come." The flap of the tent was drawn back. The god came forth. A god indeed, cloaked in the leopard skin, the double crown upon his head. Taharka was back again in the children's court in Napata as the god, his father, passed by. He wanted to fall on his knees and shield his eyes with the soldiers. He feared that the radiance might blind him. But his eyes held. As on that day, on the docks at Thebes, he stood erect. And as on that day on the docks at Thebes, he saw Shabbataka's eyes widen in recognition. Amos was speaking. "Will you hear our message, Shabbataka, Prince of Cush?" "On your knees," shouted the Somali spokesman. "On your knees before the god." "What god?" cried Amos. "I don't see a god. I see a man waiting for news. Joyful news, Shabbataka. Your brother has been restored to you. Taharka, king and pharaoh, has been restored to his people." Taharka? For a moment the silence hung in the air, like something a man could feel. Then the whispers began, then the voices, rising in the air like a wind. "Taharka?" The people, Talos had said, were not really stupid, and these were the people, the men of Cush, farmers and laborers and herders of cattle, chosen by lot, 2 out of every 10. They had wondered, never daring to speak, what had really become of Pharaoh, The kindly boy who had softened the priest's judgments, who, it was said, had once run over to pick up an old lady's comb for her. How had he died? At whose command? Had he died at all? They had been forbidden to say his name, but suddenly that name was on every tongue. Taharka? Taharka? Taharka alive? Shabbataka's eyes had never left his brother's. On that day on the docks at Thebes, he had been taken by surprise, not yet sure of his course. But now, with that forbidden name rising all around him, he knew he had no choice. He knew he had no time. "Strike them down!" The Somali guards lifted their swords and moved forward. Taharka closed his eyes, then opened them. A king must die bravely. The Somali guards did not seem to be in a hurry, and Amos, always watchful, saw that there were those among the other men who had risen from their knees, who had moved closer to this young Cushite in the shepherd's cloak, whose hands were feeling for their weapons. Shabbataka could see it too. Hesitation. A god could not allow hesitation. He must have obedience, instant obedience, or he was no longer a god. And if he were not a god, strike them down! Taharka looked at him sharply. There was something in that voice from his childhood, something he had never heard in it before. Uncertainty, or was it fear? There was a question in every mind, a question too terrible to be asked, much less answered. Taharka, king and pharaoh, has been restored to his people. Were they, for the first time ever, looking upon the face of the god? Frightened, some of them had hidden their eyes. But the Somali guards had been well trained. They had always been proud of the son of their princess. They had been given a command, but before they could reach the chariot, a man stepped out from among the throng. It's him. He didn't have a powerful voice, but in that silence, it could be clearly heard. It's him. It's Taharka. I know him. I have seen his face. And Taharka had seen his face, heard his voice. Where? When? A long time back. The river, the green banks of Cush, the black mud, the hot, hot sun. He took his spear and he killed the beast that would have killed me. And then he took his sacred cloth and tied up my wound and kept the life inside me, just like a doctor. But he's not. He's Taharka. He's the god. The man got down on his knees. He bent his face to the earth. There was a harsh cry from the blue sky above. A swiftly falling shadow, a hawk for whom Taharka had been named. It flapped down and came to rest on Taharka's wrist. It screamed again and flew suddenly straight at Shabbataka. Shabbataka ducked. The bird passed over his head. A sign! The hawk has spoken! A tall black soldier in the regalia of a commander had come to the fore of the crowd. Remember the portents? The sun himself has told us that we are led by no true pharaoh. There was a strange sound, a stirring and shuffling, the low hum of voices. Soldiers were falling to their knees, shielding their faces, whispering the unbelievable words. Taharka, Pharaoh, Taharka, king of Cush. Strike them down! It was Shabbataka almost screaming now, and the voice of Amos, Yahweh be praised, we've won. It was true. A small group of Cushites had fallen upon the Somali bodyguard and driven them back. Shabbataka was surrounded. For the first time, Taharka spoke, crying out over the confusion. Do not touch him. Put up your swords. Bring him to his tent. Chapter 26. The Return of a King. The two brothers stood face to face in the tent of the king. Cushite guards stood by the entrance. Outside could be heard the voice of the herald crying endlessly, "Taharka, son of the sun, child of the hawk, lord of Cush, great god of Napata and Meroe, pharaoh of Egypt, he has returned." "So, Pharaoh has returned," said Shabbataka. "Well, Hari, what will it be? The strangler's rope? The fire? The stake?" Taharka closed his eyes. "Imbuta, you killed him. You tried to kill me." "Him? Yes. He made me crawl. You? No, not before today." He smiled suddenly. "A funny thing, I liked you. At first I even tried to help you." And he had. Taharka remembered. No, that's not what I meant. You don't obey the sun priest. He obeys you." "But I know now I would have killed you sooner or later. It would have had to be done." "Not before today." The taster, that first sly, evil attempt, it had been the Assyrians. For some reason, Taharka was glad. And suddenly he knew what he was going to do. His eyes were as hard and sure as his brother's. He motioned to the soldiers. Shabbataka was again surrounded. He watched his brother, still smiling. "The robe," said Taharka. Shabbataka's smile faded. Slowly, he slid the leopard skin from his shoulders. He threw it to his brother. "The gold," said Taharka. They fell in a clanking heap at Shabbataka's feet. The rings, the armbands, the collar of gold, the crown of 2 lands. He took it from his brother's hands. He looked at it for a moment. It was his now, by his own choice, the choice of the army and the choice of the gods. Taharka set it upon his head. He held out his shepherd's cloak. "Put it on." Then, to the commander of the soldiers, the man who had spoken to the people, "Appoint trusted men. Send him, under guard and all secrecy, to the land of the Somalis. There, give him money and food, and set him free." "Forgive me, Imbuta. He's my brother. Besides, he owed the god of Amos an act of mercy, he who had been spared with the people of Jerusalem. And to Shabbataka, if ever again you cross into Nile country, your life is forfeit." Taharka was not a fool. Neither was Shabbataka. His brother was the army's choice. Who of his mother's tribesmen could stand against Egypt? It was over. At that moment, he would have preferred the sentence of death. One last time he spoke to the son of his father. "You begin to sound like a king, my brother. Maybe someday you will learn to be one." One last time he was the experienced older brother in the garden with the lotus pool. "You had better learn quickly. They'll be back, you know, the Assyrians. Maybe not too soon, but they'll be back." Impatient now, the guards thrust him out into the open. Taharka could no longer see his face. For the last time, he heard his voice. "Use the time you have, little brother. Use it well." Taharka stood in Pharaoh's royal chariot, the leopard skin hanging from his shoulders. He would ride through the camp, would be proclaimed God King of the 2 lands. Soon he would be back in Thebes. Yes, Shepneset, I will return. There would be times through the years when they would be together. He was the god and she was the priestess. They would manage that. Shabbataka. He would not have them cut out his name from the statues. He would not remove it from the books of the priests. After all, he himself had not really been king until today. Today, when he had chosen and been chosen. He would let his brother have his due. Amos stood by the chariot. He motioned to the herald. "Ride with Pharaoh through the camp. Proclaim the true king." Taharka held out his hand. "Amos, come." But Amos shook his head. This was the chariot of the king. Amos was withdrawing from him. With head bowed, the envoy from Judah stood before the king of Egypt and Cush. He would never come to him again as a friend, only as an ambassador to a king. Then, as the charioteer gathered up the reins, he raised his head and smiled. And Taharka knew that Amos would remember the curtain rope and Hezekiah's tunnel, how they had stood together against the Assyrians. Whether or not they ever met again, they would always be friends. Taharka reached out his arm. Their hands came together in one strong fist. Then the chariot moved out. "Behold Taharka, son of the sun, child of the hawk, lord of Cush, great god of Napata and Meroe, pharaoh of Egypt," endlessly throughout the camp. Once Taharka smiled, almost laughed. On the outskirts of the encampment were the tents of the Mukri. They had followed the Cushites, hoping for a chance at the Assyrians, a chance to avenge their tribe. "They're like Amos," thought Taharka. "They never give up." "Taharka, son of the sun, child of the hawk, lord of Cush." "Haru!" A little boy had ridden out from the Mukri camp on a silver-gray donkey. "Stop," said Taharka to the charioteer. The little boy rode up close. He looked earnestly into the face of the god. He even rested his hand on the wheel of the sacred chariot. On this strange day, the soldiers were hardly surprised. "Are you really a king, Haru?" Taharka nodded. "I knew it. I always knew you were a prince." "You're a prince too, Sabi. Someday you'll be a chief." "He'll be a good chief," he thought. "He'll be a good man. Take care of Hermes." "I know, and never let him serve the Assyrians." "And Sabi?" The horses were prancing, restless to be on their way. Taharka called back to the boy on the donkey. "Be kind to the stranger who comes to your well. Who knows? He might be a king." The end. Now, because I know you're likely not to pick this book back up, even if I tell you to, I'm going to read you the author's note. I'd like you to understand the historical context, the parts of this story that are true and the parts that are fictional. So this will add a little context for you and help as you take this fictional story and understand how it fits into the timeline we've been working on at tutorial. Taharka used his time well. He held the two lands together, and by the time of the great Assyrian invasion several years after this story, Egypt was strong enough to hold them off at the border. Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, died in a second attempt at conquest. 20 years later, near death, Taharka halted them again outside Thebes and drove them back down the Nile. For the next 30 years under his successors, the deadlock continued, exhausting the strength of the Assyrian Empire and leading to its final collapse. The few records we have for this time often contradict each other. There are no precise dates, and the Assyrians' Chronicle says that old Shabaka was king during the siege of Jerusalem. The Bible says it was Taharka, king of Ethiopia, 2 Kings 19:9. This book follows the biblical version. The Assyrians also boast of the later destruction of Thebes, but we know that Thebes was thriving and successfully carrying on the struggle until the dissolution of the Assyrian Empire. Little is recorded of Taharka beyond the fact that he overcame the pharaoh, Shabbataka, in a struggle for the crown of the Nile and was the first king of Egypt to fight the Assyrians. There's no information on his maternal patronage, but throughout history, slave soldiers like Mbuta have risen to the highest positions in African and Middle Eastern armies, and their kings, including the sultans of Morocco and Oman, have sometimes been the sons of southern African slave women, as Taharka is in my story. Shabbataka appears in the king lists before Taharka, but a later legend suggests a savage bitterness in the contest for the double crown. Shabbataka burned alive, and it is very probable that Taharka was reclaiming what had been taken from him. Taharka's generosity, on which I based my character and which contradicts the legend, is suggested by the fact that, unlike most pharaohs, he never erased his rival's name from the lists of kings. The Bible tells the story of the smiting of the Assyrians before the wall of Jerusalem and the sign of the sun retreating in 3 places. 2 Kings chapters 18 through 21, and also 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and Isaiah chapter 36. It is not clear from the biblical account what exactly happened to the besieging army, but it is certain a great many soldiers died very suddenly. The Greek historian Herodotus says an army of mice chewed the points off the Assyrian spears. In this book, it is suggested that the disaster may have been caused by a swift-acting form of bubonic plague. Sennacherib, when he wrote the stories of his exploits, boasted that he had shut up the king of Israel like a bird in a cage. He does not claim, however, to have conquered Jerusalem. King Hezekiah was able to withstand the siege partly because of his foresight in digging a tunnel from the spring outside the city into the pool of Siloam. Today, if you visit Jerusalem, you can wade down the same channel that helped save the lives of the Israelites over 2,500 years ago. Following that, which I just read you, is a section called About the Author. It's only a couple of pages, very short, and I think you'd find it interesting. It tells us a little bit about Joanne Williamson, who wrote this book, her education and past, some other books that she has written, and some of her research that she drew this book from. It goes a little bit more into detail about the annals that she found information from, and some just additional sources. So take a peek at that. It's only 2 pages and a little, not even a quarter. So I'd love for you to read that, please, before class tomorrow. And I look forward to discussing this book one final time tomorrow. I hope you've enjoyed God King. Fun way to help us understand how the history of the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and Jerusalem all tie together. We recognize names Hezekiah and Amos, and then Sennacherib and the Assyrians, and then of course Egypt and Cush, and hopefully that also helps you understand the upper and lower kingdoms and the double crown. So there you have it, God King. I've enjoyed reading it to you.